So today, we're going to tackle a huge topic, the ambitious project of actually mapping the human mind. And we're starting right at the beginning, with the very first chapter in that guide, Neurodevelopmental Disorders, which are the conditions that can shape us from our earliest days.
I mean, just think about it for a second. The human mind is, well, it's incredibly complex, right? So how in the world do you create a map of it, a reliable one that everyone can actually use to find their way around? It's a monumental challenge for sure, but it's one that experts have dedicated decades to solving.
Well, for a lot of professionals, the answer lies in one single, really powerful resource. You can almost think of it as the official dictionary, or maybe the guidebook for mental health. And this is it, the DSM-5. This book is probably the single most influential guide out there, used by clinicians, researchers, and social workers all over the world to diagnose and classify mental disorders. It gives everyone a shared framework to work from.
You know, putting this thing together was a massive undertaking. We're talking more than a decade of work by hundreds of experts from all over the world. And their goal wasn't just to make a list of disorders. It was about creating a common language. That way, a diagnosis made in a clinic in, say, New York means the exact same thing as one made in Tokyo. It's all about getting everyone on the same page.
But what's really fascinating about the DSM-5 is that it's not just some random list of conditions. It's actually organized in a very specific, very intentional way. It kind of tells a story, the story of a human life. See, the whole manual is laid out chronologically. It literally mirrors our own lives. So it kicks off with conditions that show up early in childhood. Then it moves into those that are more common in adolescence and young adulthood. And it wraps up with disorders that typically pop up later in life. It really is like a developmental blueprint for our mental health. Okay, so if we're following that logic, it makes perfect sense where we're going to focus today, right? We're diving into that very first chapter of the blueprint, the neurodevelopmental disorders. And here's the core definition, right out of the book itself. The phrase to really lock onto here is developmental period. That's the key. This means we're not talking about conditions that can just appear at any point in your life. No, these are challenges that pop up while the brain and body are still in that crucial growing phase. So all of these disorders have three main things in common. First, they show up early, usually before a kid even starts grade school. Second, they're all about what are called developmental deficits. Basically, that just means a person's development in a certain area is either delayed or just different compared to their peers. And third, and this is super important, these deficits create real, actual challenges in a person's day-to-day life. Okay, so this first chapter is pretty broad. To help make these ideas a bit more concrete, let's look at a few specific examples right from the guide.
All right, first up we have what's known as intellectual disability. This is characterized by challenges with a whole range of mental skills we pretty much use every single day. You know, things like problem solving, planning ahead, and learning from what happens to us.
Now, for a diagnosis, there are two key components that both have to be there. It's not just about struggling with academic stuff, like learning in school. The other critical piece involves what's called adaptive functioning. This is all about the skills for everyday life. Things like getting yourself dressed, handling money, or just knowing how to act in social situations. You absolutely need both pieces for a diagnosis. Okay, next up is something called global developmental delay. This is a diagnosis you'll often see used for really little kids, like under the age of 5. It's for when they're missing some of those key developmental milestones, but they're just too young for the formal standardized testing. So you can think of it almost like a placeholder diagnosis. It's a way to make sure they can get the support they need as early as possible. All right, moving on. The guide also covers communication disorders. And these, as you can imagine, affect the very foundation of how we connect with each other, our ability to understand and, of course, to be understood. This is a whole category that includes several really distinct challenges. So you've got language disorder, which is all about how we use words and build sentences. There's speech sound disorder, which is about the physical difficulty of making the right sounds. You also have social communication disorder, which makes navigating the back and forth of conversations really tough. And then there's childhood onset fluency disorder, which most of us know as stuttering, and that affects the natural flow of speech. So, okay, we've looked at the what and the how of all this, but that brings us to the most important question, right? Why? Why go through all this trouble to classify and define all these conditions in the first place?
And this, right here, is the key takeaway. The whole point of a system like the DSM-5 isn't to just slap labels on people or put them into neat little boxes. The real purpose, the ultimate goal, is to create a clear, shared language. That way, professionals can all communicate effectively with each other and, most importantly, figure out the absolute best way to provide support so that individuals can really thrive.
So, having that common language is the crucial first step. But the next step, the one that really matters, is using that shared understanding to build a more patient, more supportive world for absolutely everyone. And how do we do that? Well, that's the real work, isn't it? Thanks for joining me.